Yeah, I imagine there are positives, but I think that many pro-Brexit voters are disappointed with what the government did after the Brexit vote, after the referendum, in that they didn't take advantage of the opportunity for tax reform and deregulation. So Brexit to many, even those in the Project Leave camp, was a disappointment because it wasn't executed, first of all, until Boris Johnson finally completed the exit from the EU in 2019, late 2019. But more importantly, the government that executed Brexit, the Conservatives, the Tories, they didn't take advantage of that opportunity, again, to go back to the kind of Thatcherite, Ronald Reagan supply side economics of tax reform and deregulation. Rather, they actually governed from the center left as opposed to the center right with price caps and windfall taxes and other sort of, anti-growth policies that you'd normally associate with the left.
And trade barriers and regulatory changes have hit UK exports quite hard, haven't they? And which would you say are the industries that have been most affected? And are businesses in the UK adapting to this?
Well, I think there's big challenges, and I think the most obvious industry is energy. And the UK has gone from being energy independent in 2005 to completely dependent on imports. And the fracking ban, the ban on fracking natural gas, the ban on more additional or future leases in the North Sea for oil, those were all executed by the Conservatives, which is contrary to traditional supply side economics, which you would associate with the party of the right. And so we found ourselves in a really difficult position where the party of the right was looking for tax increases. They were putting in windfall taxes on energy companies that made money and made, according to them, too much money. So we in the UK are completely dependent on energy sources from either France in terms of electricity or Qatar or the US in terms of natural gas. And I think that's, you could argue that's better than being dependent on the Russians for natural gas, but it's something that you would not expect from the party of the right. They continue to pay 5 times, this is crazy, 5 times. The businesses in the UK pay 5 times what American businesses pay for electricity, for power. They pay about 50% more than Germany, which is not exactly known as a place that's liberated the energy sector. So I think that's one of the examples of a sector that they could have taken advantage of leaving the European Union, and they did not. And they're actually in a more difficult position than many of the other EU members.
And of course, that was high prices and the economic situation on the ground was one of the reasons why some people wanted to leave the EU in the first place, thinking it would get better. Also, right. The other big issue is, of course, freedom of movement. This is the freedom for people who are EU citizens to live and work wherever in the EU. At the end, when Brexit happened, of course, that was the end of free movement. And it's led to labour shortages in healthcare, in agriculture, in logistics. How has this impacted the United Kingdom, would you say? And has it been a...
Well, I'd have to say it's been negative, but again, not because of just Brexit, leaving the EU. It's that they didn't implement policies that would liberate legal immigration. So instead of free movement, it would be immigration for sectors like healthcare that you mentioned, that where we need additional employment. So on one hand, we have employment challenges. On the other hand, we have illegal migrants coming in on boats. And that's been, something that again, the Tories were disappointing in terms of their handling, and that you can thank the Tories for the rise of the Reform Party and done a great job in actually focusing on what the people are interested in. And so I think again, I think there's still an opportunity, but that opportunity was in 2016. They didn't take advantage of it. And now we are, 5 years later, or more than 5 years later, not really in any terribly different position than we were in 2016. So, it's 5 years since the actual Brexit, but it's really 9 years since the people voted to leave the EU.
And foreign investment, another negative I feel we might be going to. Maybe there will be a positive somewhere on this list, but I'm not quite sure there will be. Foreign investment in the UK has dropped significantly. What factors do you think have driven businesses to relocate? And has that ability to trade within the EU really made so many businesses leave the United Kingdom?
I I would argue that it's not the inability to trade in the EU. I think the problem is that the energy costs are significantly higher here. That's very difficult for businesses. And why would investors invest in the UK when the taxes are too high? They were raised, if anything. If you make too much money, there's the threat of windfall taxes. Again, these are all things identified with parties of the left, in spite of the fact that the conservatives were in power for over a decade. What I would argue, I'm looking for some good news here. I would argue there is a real shift in momentum, in spite of the Labour government being in power, and there's really little chance of an election before 2029. However, the mood shift here is much more to the right and towards liberating the economy, lowering taxes. Again, I don't think that will happen because the Labour government is in power. But there is a real movement in the West in general and in the rest of Europe, toward a more populist, conservative economic agenda. And I think that's, you're seeing that in the polls, you're seeing that in what people want. And Europeans, especially here in the UK, are looking at what's happened in America with President Trump winning the election and all of the first 2 weeks of the administration as a real positive economic message. And I think many would like to replicate that. And you're seeing parties all over the world trying to replicate that common sense revolution of tax reform and deregulation. I think it could work here in the UK. I wish they had done it back in 2016 and then again in 19 when they had the opportunity. But they failed to do that. I think there's hope, and I think the sentiment is really changing.
I think you're right. I don't disagree that the UK electorate has moved to the right. But then we see other polls on Brexit specifically saying that public sentiment on Brexit has shifted and that 55% of Britons now believe leaving the EU was a mistake. However, the Labour government under Keir Starmer has said there's no chance of that happening, and there's no chance of rejoining the single market either. Do you think that was a mistake, or do you think, since you say that it's probably not going to happen, that we're going to have lower taxes in the UK any time soon? Was it a mistake not to open things up and to cut off the chance of joining the single market?
Look, they were in the single market for a long time, so I don't think that, we can kind of turn the clock back. I think many were disappointed. So you have your Remainers, and, the people that voted to remain are probably very disappointed that they lost the referendum. But then you have a lot of many people that voted to leave, voted for Brexit, and are disappointed in the lack of execution and the lack of taking advantage of this opportunity. So that's why I think Brexit polls pretty low. And even some conservatives prior to the referendum vote were very skeptical about the government at the time, the David Cameron government. They were skeptical about their ability to embrace Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and go back to deregulation and lower taxes. And now you have a situation where it's the worst of both. They're no longer in the single market, but they haven't really taken advantage and gone back to the sort of traditional supply side economics. So for many, it's the worst of both. But again, I think that sentiment is changing. You could see a new government in 2029, that will actually take advantage of Brexit and not being tied by their regulations.
Okay, let me just ask you one quick final question.
Sure.
What does the future hold for the UK's economy? Is it going to get better in this Parliament or in 2025? And if you could be brief, we only have about a minute left.
Okay. I do not think it will get better soon, and I think that you've seen Labour pivot a little bit toward deregulation. You saw that in many of the comments from the government this week, from Rachel and Keir. there is a pivot toward deregulation, but I don't think it will be enough. They are still somewhat connected to net zero. And until they drop that, I don't think there's a hope for an economic revival here in the UK.